Okay, take three. Welcome back. This episode isn't that much about debunking myths or breaking down structure or reviewing movies or TV shows or whatever. It's about something just as heavy, though: reverence, originality, and the stories we treat like relics, sealed in glass. I started working on this episode because I felt like some stories get treated with a kind of deference that borders on sacred, as if they were holy artifacts like the Shroud of Turin, something you're supposed to admire and never really question that much. The language around it even sounds religious, like you're supposed to see it with awe and all that kind of stuff. And maybe that's okay. Maybe reverence has its place. For example, there's a quote from East of Eden that hits me like a freight train, and honestly, I have to admit I've never even read the book. But here the quote goes: "In uncertainty, I am certain that underneath their topmost layers of frailty, men want to be good and want to be loved. If he dies unloved, his life must be a failure to him, and his dying a cold horror." End quote. So that's not just like literature right there. That's a truth that you can carry with you. You know, it's almost like a haunting message, and I could see somebody seeing that as being sacred. But when we canonize certain books, when we elevate some stories above all others, we do risk building a wall, and that's sort of what this episode's about here. Not just between high and low art, but between cultures, languages, and perspectives, between who gets to tell stories and who we're willing to listen to. And granted, I agree you don't necessarily listen to everybody, because, for one thing, even putting aside that people often have garbage views and all that, but you have limited time on this earth. You're not going to be able to listen to every single voice that comes along. So, on that note, I do respect you for listening to mine. You may have stumbled upon it somehow, and hey, hello there. You know, I'm very appreciative of your ability to listen to my voice. And there have always been great writers outside the Western canon, of course. There always have been. But how often do we Americans read them, teach them, and revere them? Well, I suppose it's a separate question of how often do we read Americans when it comes to the illiteracy that is unfortunately pretty common in American culture. And, I'm not trying to be on a high horse here. I definitely don't read as much as I used to. I'm just now starting to read Dracula by Bram Stoker. It's really just seemed like about time that I approached that book, right? So I'm not trying to be on a high horse here. And here's the grounding problem: if we treat certain books like sacred texts, we can end up ignoring the voices that are rising now, voices that could make us more humanely aware of each other and that sort of thing. So let's talk about the myth that all of the great stories have already been written. I think you've all heard that line before. Maybe you've said it. I probably have. It seems like everything's already been said, everything's already been done. It seems like history is repeating, and the rotten parts are the most prominent, and the the great works are not quite as cyclical, right? You don't have as many masterpieces coming out in literature, maybe even in music, whatever. The art world, it doesn't seem like it's generating as many masterpieces as in previous times. And sure, that seems partly true, but there are only so many core plot lines, love, revenge, survival, redemption, transformation. You can easily get pretty cynical about that stuff if you've heard it before already. We've seen seemingly every type of hero's rise and fall, every betrayal, every return. But if you get too cynical about that, you're sort of missing the point. Originality isn't about inventing something from nothing, it's about what you do with what already exists, and of course, what came before. So, Shakespeare kind of stole plots, Tarantino remixes them, and countless others rewrote the universe in their own voices. The structure wasn't entirely new, but certain, I guess, patterns, certain unique ways of telling stories were relatively new. The power of a story isn't just in its bones, it's in the flesh, the voice, the details, and the perspective. After all, if you really pick apart a story and look at its bones, that's sort of all they are. The real meat is in the unique way of the tale being told. And, does it have urgency? That's where the newness lives, I suppose you could say. So, no, all the great stories haven't been written technically because your story hasn't been told. Not your way, not yet. So think about what it's saying about you if you're saying that all the great stories have been told. You're saying that your story isn't that great, possibly. You know what I mean? If you're sort of dismissing your own life experience, you're saying, "Oh, my life story that would make a good book or something like that." Hell with that. Even if your life is relatively boring, if you tell your life story in a certain way, it can be about as exciting as anything. That's really the power of quality writing is you can make sort of a generic experience seem like an earth-shattering one. It's the same thing with music. You can strum a few simple chords, you can pound away on a few piano keys, and it might not seem significant if you dissect it too much, but sometimes there can be power in simplicity and just in the way that the individual artist arranges things. So it's not always about complexity and that sort of thing. So, for those of us who read what's often called world literature, the goal shouldn't be to replace the canon, but just to widen it. To say there's space here for more stories, more truths, more lives, more contemplation, and yes, more diversity of culture and experience. I know diversity is a spooky word these days for some people, but you know, the intelligent ones out there, they're not afraid of multiculturalism, the great boogeyman of the conservative mind. And really think about what that says about you if you're that afraid of encountering cultures that are different from yours. You're basically admitting that you're a coward of a certain type. Maybe you're not that spooked by the existence of other cultures, but if you're approaching it from some supremacist attitude or something like that, you're not being contemplative as a person who's viewing the world. You're not really looking at the depth of other people's lives and their experiences, their truths, their stories, and all of that stuff. You're basically just simplifying them to the nth degree, most likely stereotyping them, and you're probably afraid of them. You're being chicken if that is your attitude, and you can potentially dig your way out of that sort of mindset just by you know sometimes engaging with literature. If you learn about other cultures and compare them to your own in an honest way, you might find that yes, other cultures do have some things that might seem spooky at first. They might have some dark components to their histories and all that kind of stuff. But guess what? Your own culture has that as well. So deal with it, just as other people have to deal with whatever ideas that you put forward, you should be able to respect the basic premise of actually learning about the values of other cultures and not stereotyping them, but learning the strengths as well as the weaknesses. And you should do that inwardly as well, because like the culture that I live in as an American, there are some very dark things not just happening now, but of course that were created in the past. Some dark histories. Well, I guess I am starting to get political here, I suppose, but I kind of suggested that I wasn't going to get political, but here I am. You know. Now let's talk about the so-called great books. I was a great books major in college. I I almost feel illiterate now because I don't read nearly as often as I used to. But nevertheless, I was a great books major. I was, one of those nerds, one of those intellectual elites, you might say. I mean, it was just a 4 year degree that I earned from a small university. And some people out there make that sound like I'm some snob. But, I did have an interest in experiencing new books that I hadn't read before. So that's what I majored in at the university that I attended, the prestigious Finlandia University, which is so prestigious that it no longer even exists. But when it comes to great books, there's this idea that fiction peaked before World War II. You might have heard that view at some point if you are at all engaged in talk about literature. There's this view that post war novels lack depth or drama. Maybe that says more about changing tastes than any real drop in quality, however. And let's not forget, even before World War II, a lot of English language fiction was mediocre, or maybe even just crap. The greats were outliers, not the standard. That's why we call them greats. So, the idea that there's not going to be anything great that's coming out now or in the future in terms of literature or any other creative venture. It's just you're selling people a little bit too short. I'm of the belief that you got to take the good with the bad. So sure that there are some bad things coming out now, some mediocre stuff, but somewhere maybe you'll never even get around to reading it, but there's some treasure buried out there. So maybe it's not that modern writers are failing, maybe we've just raised the bar impossibly high, or maybe we're just not getting lucky enough to read whatever out there is actually great. Maybe we'll never stumble upon that. And expecting brilliance on every page while ignoring the grind that even legends went through, that's sort of on you, I suppose. And then there's this: how do we even judge what makes a story great? Is it the drama, the language, the innovation, popularity? Should writers stay within tradition or break every rule? Your answers to those questions reveal something deeper about what you value, about what kind of world you want stories to reflect. So here's where I land. We should still honor the greats. There's not necessarily any problem with that, no more than there would be a problem with, I guess, honoring the current writers. So there's absolutely validity in honoring the greats in their own way, but not at the cost of freezing literature and time. Great stories are still being written right now in every language, in every genre, and in every place. Some of them just haven't been unwrapped yet. So, thanks for listening. I hope you like this episode. I I can't really help it if you didn't, but you could always subscribe, click the like button, do all of that fun stuff, and hopefully I provided some food for thought. If not, oh well, maybe better luck next time.